Thank you very much. Let me start by welcoming you all to the LSE. It's a place of which I'm deeply fond. I've been a professor here for more than 30 years, perhaps 40% of that time on leave trying to change the world. Well, isn't always very grateful for those efforts, but that 40% where I've been away is falling and will continue to fall monotonically for as far as I can see. We also sit in a room where past directors of the LSE are portrayed, and you see there IG Patel on the far left or the far side at the top, and IG Patel, the name of my chair is the IG Patel chair. IG was a predecessor of Raghu here and a great influence on all of us. In fact, IG hired me in the 1980s, so I have a deep respect for his judgment. But also, he was a model in many ways to us as with education, with a place like the LSE, which is so deeply international. Comes an obligation to commit oneself to the study of how the world works, but the study of how the world works largely, in his case and many of us, from the perspective of policy and trying to change how it works. And that takes us directly to the Policy Lab, and I want to congratulate my friend and colleague Eric for the tremendous initiative that he's taken, and I think you can see from the quality of the audience here today how much enthusiasm and quality enthusiasm there is out there for this endeavor. And also to congratulate Eric for, at the launch of this, beginning with the two most important countries in the world. And it doesn't take long to work out that those are China and India, and any international policy lab has to have those two countries absolutely at the core. Not the only things at the core, but the first things at the core of international policy. Now, I share with my good friend Adair that empirically, the purpose of the banking system doesn't seem to be, and actually isn't, the finance of investment, notwithstanding the textbooks that we offer students. But I do take the view that the purpose of the international financial system, and in particular the international development banking system, is to finance investment. And that really is my theme today. And I think it's more than any old investment, because it's an international development banking system, international financial system, put together by countries, that it is investment with a shared purpose. So what is that shared purpose? Well, actually, we can answer that question much better in the last couple of years than we could before. And I want to compare the global agenda of 2015-16 with the global agenda of the late 1940s. The last time, actually, I think we had a global agenda. In the global agenda of the 1940s, we had seen 2 world wars and a Great Depression in the preceding 30 years. It had to be in the John Cleese category of blindingly obvious that cooperation was going to do better than what had gone on in the previous 3 or 4 decades. There was blood everywhere. The evidence that it was much better to collaborate was crystal clear. Unpleasantly crystal clear, but it was crystal clear. What we saw in the global agenda of 2015, by which I mean primarily the Sustainable Development Goals of September 2015 and the Paris Climate Agreement of December, in each case nearly 200 countries gathering together to draw up an agenda which applied to them all, decided by them all, applying to them all, not the MDGs which applied to developing countries, but an agenda which applied to everybody. That agenda in 2015 was an agenda which looked forward to development goals, looked forward to the grave risks of climate change. It anticipated. So you had 200 countries anticipating problems and looking for a shared agenda around the Sustainable Development Goals. Compare that with the 44 countries of Bretton Woods, pre-decolonization, of course. And in Bretton Woods, you had one powerful bossy country, and United States, and another country that thought it was still tremendously influential, perhaps in error, United Kingdom. So what happened in 2015 compared with what happened in the late 40s was actually extraordinary and encouraging from the point of view of what human beings and nations can do when they get together. Now, we all know that life is full of difficulties and uncertainties and elephant traps. But when you get something of real value like that, it's important to recognize it. So I take as the global agenda that primarily Sustainable Development Goals, but I see the Paris Climate Agreement in large measure as integrated with the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the global agenda. Investment with a shared purpose. We can identify, broadly speaking, and it can only be broadly speaking, what that shared purpose is. Now, the second point I want to make after establishing that that is our shared purpose is the urgency and scale. We are really in a hurry. If you just look at development goals about poverty, functioning of cities, education, health, gender, and so on, all those things that are of fundamental importance, those things can be achieved sooner or later. Much better if it's sooner, but they can be achieved sooner or later. Now, the problem with climate is that we have a real problem of time, because there's a fixed budget constraint, essentially, in terms of the integral of global emissions, if we're to have any chance of holding below 2 degrees, the Paris objective, and an objective which is deeply well-founded in the risks that we face. Essentially, look at it like this. The world economy will roughly double in the next 20 years or so, a growth rate of 3%. It doesn't matter if it doubles in 18 years or 28 years for this argument, but broadly speaking, the world economy doubles in 20 years. If you look at the rate of growth of infrastructure demand, as countries move through levels of income where the elasticity of demand for energy transport are pretty high, and in a context where the world is urbanizing very rapidly, the world in the next 30 or 40 years will probably go from 50% of a bit over 7 billion to 70% of a bit over 9 billion in its cities. That's ballpark 3.5 billion or so now to 6.5 billion or so by mid-century. If you look at those things together, you see that the infrastructure will more than double. So the world economy will double, infrastructure will more than double. If that world economy that we create, the new one, in the next 20 years or so, and the much more than doubling infrastructure, if that looks anything like what we've got now, then you can forget about 2 degrees, you can probably forget about 3 degrees. We haven't seen 3 degrees temperature increase for about 3 million years. Our civilizations, essentially, from the last ice age, the Holocene, the last 8,000 or 9,000 years, even a generous definition of Homo sapiens gives you 250,000 years. Yeah, 3 degrees you haven't seen for 3 million years. This is taking us into territory which, to put it mildly, is extraordinarily risky. We don't fully understand it, but I think we can understand that it's extraordinarily risky and that it would be reckless to go there. So, in distinction really from the Millennium Development Goals, now our understanding is such that we really are in a hurry. So we've got a shared purpose. It's a very attractive, exciting purpose. It's entirely feasible if we make it so, but we are in a hurry. Now, in that overall story, there is a key role for sustainable infrastructure. Infrastructure is responsible for perhaps 70% or so of emissions. Infrastructure in its use responsible for 70% or so emissions. If you look forward, probably around 70% of that infrastructure coming in the next 20 years or so will be in emerging market and developing countries. Well, multiply 0.7 by 0.7, you get roughly a half. So half of the story that we're talking about is actually infrastructure in emerging market and developing countries. Much of that's going to be built one way or the other. So the question is, how is it built? What sort of quality, what sort of scale? And there it seems to me that the role of the multilateral development banks is absolutely fundamental. Now, we have no shortage of savings in the world, and we have no shortage of wonderful investment, sustainable investment opportunities. What we do have a shortage of is the translation of the sustainable investment opportunities into real investment demand. That's largely a policy and institutional story, and we have a shortage of the right kind of finance for those long-term sustainable investment infrastructure opportunities as they get translated through good policy and institutions, we hope, that's part of the policy challenge, into demand. So there I see the role of the MDBs, multilateral development banks, as fundamental. Now you can say, well, I wouldn't I, because I spent 10 years of my life as chief economist of either a regional development bank, the EBRD, or the World Bank, and I'm on international advisory panel of the AIIB, which is a tremendous institution. I was very much involved in the creation of the BRICS Bank, the new development bank. But I see tremendous potential of that system in relation to the problem that I just tried to define. Now, it's very important. There are many people who don't understand why development banks are so powerful. Many people in this world, we don't really have a government right now because we're in between, we've got an election going. But in the past government and in preceding governments, you find a lot of people who don't understand why it is that development banks can do things that other banks can't do. There are many people here from the EBRD, they're probably the best of all the development banks at the moment, which will understand that what we try to do in a development bank is to pursue investments in relation to an overall strategy based on the ideas I just defined, but investments which are sound banking in terms of risk return. They're additional, they do things which the existing markets banks couldn't do, and of course that combination of additionality and sound banking is used for a purpose, which is development impact or transition impact in the EBRD. The key thing then is to recognize that a development bank can both be sound banking and be additional. Now, if all world capital markets were perfect and all banks were identical, then you couldn't do, there would be no additionality possible. Sound banking is sound banking, and this bank couldn't bring anything new. But of course, all capital markets are not perfect. You don't have to be in this audience to work that out. And the development banks do have special characteristics. They have the long-term the ability to take a long-term view founded on their ownership structure. They have a range of instruments which ordinary banks wouldn't necessarily be able to do. For example, political risk guarantees, they can do both equity and long-term loans and translate one into another. So they are not the same. So capital markets are not perfect, and the institutions that we're talking about have very strong comparative advantages based on their ownership and institutional structures and endowments of interest. That's why they can be additional and sound banking. You can bring things that others can't and make money, and good development banks do exactly that. Bad development banks are subject to all kinds of political perversion and so on, and good international development bank actually has, as it were, some checks and balances in there through its ownership structure. So they're very wonderful instruments if used well, and the wonderful Keynes created the idea of paid-in capital and callable capital, so you only have to put in a little money up front and you can generate a lot of lending potential at quite modest, indeed extremely modest gearing ratios, often 1-for-1. So that's why they can be so effective. But at the moment, they lend about 40-50 billion a year for infrastructure. No, the new banks will start to push that up, but that's what they do. We're talking about infrastructure in the world a bit over 3 trillion a year now, dollars, and rising to 6, 7, 8 trillion over this next 20 years. Now, you're not asking the development banks to do everything. Obviously, they couldn't. But what you are asking them is to be present in sufficient scale to be really influential in terms of setting standards, finding new ways of doing things, being creative, being at the vanguard, leading the charge in many ways, partnering, of course, all the time with the private sector. So in my view, that 50 billion a year would need to translate to 150, 200 billion a year with a, say, 3-4 private sector multiplier. You're in the region of these banks being involved in investment somewhere over $500 billion a year. If they're involved in investments in sustainable infrastructure, something like $500 billion a year, I think it becomes reasonable to suppose they could really influence the 3, 4, 5, 6 trillion that are going on. So that seems to me to be a key thing that we should do. But because of the power of the called-in capital and payable, because of the power of paid-in capital and callable capital, you can do that on comparatively modest sums. You could change the gearing ratio from 1 to 1.5, from very, very, very conservative to very, very conservative. That would be fine too. Doing those two things, putting in $50, $60 billion of capital, changing the gearing ratio, then you could do what I've just described. So what I've tried to show is that we do have a world agenda. It's remarkable that we do. It gives us a shared purpose for investment. Much more research along the lines I've described is necessary, but it's the old story. You have to simultaneously do the research and take out what you've got to influence policy now. That's the joy and perils of being an academic researcher who's trying to influence public policy. You've got to do both at the same time. You can't say, give me another 3 or 4 years and I'll work that out. Certainly not if you've got the kind of deadlines that I described. And anyway, people are going to do things now, so you'd better be ready to influence. But I do think we have enough arguments marshaled now. I've been working away with many colleagues, Amar Bhattacharya, Jeremy Oppenheim, and others, my colleagues here at the LSE. There's much more to do, but I think we have a case now which we can put together with the urgency and the attractiveness of the challenge to try to get political traction. And as IG would have said, that is our duty. Thank you.